So on the cardiac cycle here, you can see the pressure at the beginning of atrial diastole or ventricular diastole. Aortic pressure is decreasing, and the ventricular pressure is decreasing because the valves are open. They're still open. The AV valve is actually closed during this stage, so the pressure stays the same because the volume is staying the same. And that's happening because the AV valves are closed. So the pressure is decreasing because nothing's contracting. It's all relaxing. And the blood is just going from the atrium to the ventricle. But so it's so the aortic pressure is decreasing because we've already ejected, right? Everything's ejected from there. And that's showing at the beginning there, the aortic kind of ejection from the aorta. So the aortic is going, let's look at the ventricles. So the left ventricular pressure and the left atrial pressure, they're pretty much, there's no pressure building because the valves are open and you're not trapping the blood in there at this point. So the pressure starts to build at the end here, which is when contraction occurs. So atrial systole. Oh, wait. Yeah, at the end of this, you have atrial systole. So at the end of diastole, you have atrial systole. So the pressure then starts to increase a little bit then because because you've got contraction of the atrium. But it's not a huge thing. So the pressure increases there. Pressure is decreased because the valves are open and they're just filling. So in the beginning, they're kind of decreasing or just pretty much staying the same. And then it's only increase in pressure when you have the contraction of the atria. That's, what you're seeing in the P wave here at the end of diastole and beginning of the atrial systole. So this is really like there's three things going on during that first stage, which makes this first part a little bit confusing. But the pressure only increases, so you guys had the most difficult one, I'm sorry. The pressure only increases when the atria contract. Does that make sense? So the pressure stays the same because the valves are closed and there's no blood going in, there's no blood going out, and so it just pretty much for that very small period of time, which is called isovolumetric contraction, it stays the same. So at the end of the P wave, when the atria are relaxing, and they're beginning to relax, and depolarizations or repolarizations occurring in the atria, you have this isovolumetric. So the volume on each side is basically the same, and it's stable. The volume is going to stay the same because the valves are closed. Does that make sense? Pressure is going to be the same because the valves are closed, and there's no buildup of new blood. All right, so then the pressure increases because the ventricles contract and the valve is closed, but then the valve opens and the pressure goes down whenever you have, after the ejection, the pressure goes down. So at the beginning of the diastole, the pressure is going to go down because you're both in the aorta and in the ventricles because you've just ejected all that blood from the ventricles into the aorta. So that's what's happening with the pressure. Now let's look at the volume. So the volume increases because the valves are opening, the AV valve is opening, so blood's going from the atrium to the ventricle. So volume is increasing in there. And then there's a little increase when systole occurs. So you can see a little bump whenever the atria contract. So it's filling always, but then that last little bit of the atria, boom, blood from the atria is going into the ventricles, so the volume increases yet again, but it's like another bump because of the atria contracting, and so you get another boost of it filling because of that. But it stays the same because the AV valves close. The volume stays the same because the AV valves are closed. Then it decreases because the ventricles are contracting and they're ejecting the blood, and then the relaxation occurs. So the valves, the SL valves close, and so you have equal volume and equal volumetric because of relaxation. So you have equal isovolumetric means equal volume on both sides of the atrium and the ventricle, and that like keeps the valves, that's sort of what causes the valves to close, so that you don't have backflow into the ventricles, so they close. And that's after the atria contract, the AV valves close, and after the ventricles contract, the SL valves close. That makes sense, right? They open up when the blood's flowing in, and they close when the blood has flowed out to keep it from going back. So what's happening with the EKG? You have the P wave, the atria contracts, and that's depolarization of the atria. That's what causes it. The QRS wave occurs, ventricles depolarize, and atria repolarizes. Then you have ejection. So that's caused by the ventricles being contracting, and so then the repolarization of the ventricles occurs here, and that's what causes the T wave. So we've been through that. I think you've got that EKG part down. It's just like thinking about what happens with the volume of the blood and the pressure building up because the valves are closed and then you've got ventricles contracting. That definitely is hugely increasing because your valves are closed and you have contraction of the ventricles. You're going to get a huge spike of volume, but the rest of them are just tiny little spikes like when the atria contract. This is all because the ventricles are ejecting the blood and the pressure builds up until the blood flows out. So the heart sounds, this is one, the last one, they got this last part. So when the ventricles repolarize, and that starts, the AV valves close. So after the atria has contracted, actually this is atrial repolarization. Okay. Atrial repolarization. Let's go back and look at that. So on the heart sounds, the first heart sound is here. This is the heart. It's hard to see. That's one. So this is when the AV valves close. So after the atria have contracted, when the atria are beginning to repolarize, you get that heart sound because of the AV valve closing. So this happens during isovolumetric contraction, and then the SL valves close during isovolumetric relaxation. That's what she was drawing an arrow down to here. So this occurs during the valves, AV valves close first. After the atria have contracted, the AV valves close. After the ventricles contract, the SL, the semilunar valves close. Does this make sense? After they contract, they've spewed out their blood into the next chamber or into the atria or the aorta and the pulmonary arteries. The valves then close. And that closing of the valves is what you're hearing as the lub and the dub. So the first heart sound, the loud lub, is made when the AV valves, the bicuspid and tricuspid valves, close. The second heart sound is softer, that's the dup, when the semilunar valves close. And there's a third sound, this little, during diastole, that you'll see, and that's heard in young people, like if you're in adolescence, maybe, children and adolescents maybe, but people over 30, you don't hear the sound at all. So it's this one right here, not in the isovolumetric relaxation, but a little bit after that during the ventricular filling, and we're not entirely sure what causes it, but we do hear that, and that would be the third sound. So cardiac cycle, If you have tachycardia, that is when it's like resting heart rate is above 100. So your normal resting heart rate is what? 70, 75, somewhere in that range. And so 100 would be very, very fast. So your heart is all of a sudden, beating very fast. This is not talking about exercising. When you're exercising, obviously it's going to be higher, but during a rest. Bradycardia is when you have slow heart rate, less than 50. Now, obviously there are some athletes that have a really low heart rate. Resting heart rate is normally low, but this is like in just an average person, 50 heartbeats per minute, that's bradycardia. So you need to know those two terms. Any kind of bold printed terms like this could be in a matching question on the test, so make sure you know those terms. So the nerve supply to the heart, so what's going on and how do we control the rate, like the speed? So we know that there is a self-generating, the sinoatrial node self-generates the signal from the AV valve or SA node to the AV node, but the cardiac center is in the medulla oblongata, and it's going to respond to baroreceptors, which that depends on pressure. So baroreceptors receive like signals as far as like how much the vessel is stretching and how much it stretches in the carotid sinus or in the aortic bodies. Those are chemoreceptors, but there's baroreceptors here in the aorta, down here at the base of the aorta, and then up here in the arch. And then you also have the carotid sinus contains some baroreceptors. So those baroreceptors detect stretch in the blood vessel, detecting how much pressure, and that determines if the heart rate needs to be increased or decreased. So if the stretch is too little, if the stretch is too much, if the pressure is too high or too low, then that's going to send a signal to the medulla oblongata. So if your heart rate is too high, if your blood pressure is too high, what are you going to do to the rate of the heart? What do you want to do? Increase it or decrease it? Okay, if you say increase,
if the pressure's too high, decrease.
You want to decrease it. So the pressure is too high, you want to decrease the pressure, but how do you do that? Do you increase or decrease the heart rate? Decrease it. So cardiac output is determined by the stroke volume, so how much is going to eject from the heart, and then how many beats per second. And so the only way you can decrease the total like blood pressure is to decrease the cardiac output. And so you either have to lower the volume that is being ejected, so how much the heart contracts, or you have to lower the rate. And so that to decrease blood pressure, you would do that. So the cardiac accelerator is in the sympathetic nervous system, is going to cause the heart rate to increase, and the parasympathetic is going to cause the opposite. It's going to cause it to decrease. So the reason for this is that they secrete norepinephrine, which is going to increase the heart rate. That's what its response is. And the atrioventricular and the sinoatrial nodes both receive signals from a nerve. That nerve is going to send out a neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter is going to be received. So acetylcholine slows, norepinephrine, epinephrine increase. So you should always remember the sympathetic raises the heart rate, parasympathetic lowers the heart rate. It's like when you're relaxing at rest. But if you want to get away from a woolly mammoth, you need that adrenaline. You need that norepinephrine, epinephrine. So that's what's going to be released. Norepinephrine in this case is what's released from the sinoatrial and the atrioventricular nodes, and that helps to speed up the rate. So the cardiac output can peaks when you are at like 160 to 180 beats per minute. If you go faster than that, you're not going to increase the cardiac output overall. Your stroke volume and your cardiac output are less than at rest even at that point. So it's not helping you to get higher than 180. So 160, 180 is like your optimal cardiac output. So parasympathetic is going to include the vagus nerve, and we talked about the vagal reflex and how it can make you pass out, because it decreases the heart rate. Decreases the heart rate, which slows the heart and lowers the blood pressure. So slowing the heart rate lowers the blood pressure. So if your heart rate is too high, then you signal these nerves that are part of the vagus nerve that inhibits the impulses, so you don't get as many impulses, and that slows the heart rate. It also releases acetylcholine, which is going to be one that is going to be inhibitory. Why is it inhibitory? Because it opens up these potassium channels, which instead of making it positive, it makes it negative. It hyperpolarizes the nerve. Anytime you add like sodium, that's going to increase. It's going to make it go up. The electrical signal is going to go up towards threshold. But when you have potassium going in, it's going to make it go down. It's going to make it hyperpolarize. So it actually fires less frequently, and then therefore if you have less frequent firing of the sinoatrial node, your heart rate slows, your contractions slow. So vagal tone is going to hold the heart rate at this normal resting. That's what the parasympathetic system does, is it keeps you at rest. It keeps everything homeostasis at rest. And it's going to keep it at 70 to 80 beats per minute. So that's the normal vagal background, kind of what you should have for sinus rhythm. So now cardiac output. If you need to take a picture of this, go ahead and do so right now, because I'm going to erase this. I don't know exactly how I'm going to ask a question on this yet, but probably going to be like a matching type thing, or it could be some multiple choice questions. But this just kind of puts everything all together, and it's based on this little chart that I gave you. But I mean, you should take this chart and do it yourself. Try to look through and analyze this chart. So if I had just shown you this chart and not made you do this, you just said, okay, and then just moved on, you wouldn't have really looked at it. So I'm making you review this because this puts everything together. And although you've got this EKG and the heart sounds, you really need to probably look at the pressures and especially the volumes. So if you increase pressure, it's because you've decreased the volume. So as volume decreases because you contract, that's going to increase pressure. Okay, I'm erasing this so I can. Okay, take a little brain break. Look over your notes, summarize while I'm erasing. So we got about 20 minutes left. All right, that's good enough. All right. We lost some people. All right, let's talk about cardiac output. So cardiac output, there's a formula for this. It is stroke volume times heart rate. Stroke volume is the amount of blood ejected. So, to increase cardiac output, what can you do? Increase your heart rate, or you can yes, you can. You can cause your heart to contract more strongly, and so you get more volume going through it. So you can increase stroke volume a little bit. But mainly, it's your heart rate. So the two things that are going to impact cardiac output would be how fast it beats and how much blood is being ejected. So the stroke volume and how much blood is being ejected has to do with the contractibility of the heart. So there's a maximum, like I said, at 160, 180, that's the optimal. After that, your stroke volume is not as much as it was at rest, but because there's not enough blood, right? You can do it faster, but after about 180 beats to the 130 or 230, you don't have as much blood, you don't have any more blood to increase the stroke volume. So there is a limit. But you can increase this, and as you exercise, the contractibility, like your muscle, this has to do with preload and then contractibility and afterload. So how tense and how stretched your heart is to begin with, and then how much you contract it, and then how much is left at the end. And like as you increase the contractibility, that increases the tension, which increases the contractibility, and it's like an endless kind of loop as you exercise. So as you warm up your heart, it stretches. It's already like stretched that causes more contraction or a stronger contraction, which then causes more blood to flow out. And then you have more stronger. This is the Frank Starling law, and it's in your book. Not in the PowerPoint, but it's in your book to talk about that. But in any case, let's talk about edema. So where does the blood go from your right ventricle? Does it go to the body or does it go to the lungs? The lungs. So if you have more, like if they're supposed to be equal, the amount that is ejected from both of these should be equal, should be both 70. But if one has like 100 mils and the other one only has 70, then what's going to happen? Where's that blood going to end up mostly? If the right ventricle ejects 100 and the left ventricle only ejects 70, they're not equal. More is being ejected from the right ventricle, then where is it going to end up? Where's the swelling going to be? Where's the edema going to be? In the lungs. If you have a left ventricle that is exceeding the right ventricle, if too much is going out of your left ventricle, then what's happening? Where's the blood going to end up? It's going to be in your lowest part of your body, in your systems, all the fluid throughout your system. So you have edema, swelling, so systemic edema. That's what this is talking about. And so that is very important. They should be the same. And if there's not, then you've got swelling. If you have swelling and you can't explain it, then there may be something wrong with one of your heart muscles, like the left or right heart muscle. Maybe it's not getting enough oxygen, or there could be some other issues. But the congestive heart failure, a lot of times you have a lot of swelling, and that's due to the lack of, one side of the heart is working harder than the other. So cardiac output, typical 70 beats per minute, or 75 beats per minute. 70 mils is your typical stroke volume. So that's about 5.25 liters per minute are going through your body. Blood's being pumped through your body. So there's some other things that your ventricles will hold like 130 mils is your end diastolic volume. So at the end of relaxation, end diastolic volume. So at the end of ventricular diastole, when the ventricles have contracted, you're going to have this much blood in your heart. Then, during your ejection volume, which is your stroke volume, is about 70. So how much is left typically at the end of contraction? So the end of systolic volume would be 60 mils. So your ventricles do have a little bit of blood that does not get ejected. There's just some that's circulating always left in there, possibly to give you a little bit more if you need to increase your cardiac output in exercise, but there's always just that little reserve that's left over. Now, for someone who's moderately exercising, 17.5 liters per minute will go out. So this is at rest, 5.25 liters. But when you're exercising, it's about 3 times more than that. And then when you're in a fit person, they have a stronger heart, so they can have a stronger stroke volume. So you can increase your stroke volume if you are training your heart aerobically and you are strengthening that heart aerobically. And you can, in a fit person, and that's what's the difference. They're not doing faster beats per minute. In fact, their heart rate is much lower. We had some people from the football team in my AMP class one year, and we were doing the cardiovascular exercise, and they could not get their heart rate above 60 beats per minute. They could not. I mean, they had to run up and down the stairs like 5 times, these stairs out here. And they couldn't, it was impossible. And as soon as they stopped, it's like, boom, back down to 60. Like, it takes me 5 minutes to get back down to 70, like, or even 130 after I've been exercising, right? So in a fit person, their stroke volume is much greater. And so it's not that their heart is beating faster, it's that their stroke volume is greater. Does that make sense? Because, and it makes sense to me, but anyway, I just want to make sure it makes sense to you. I'm saying that a lot today. But this is the 70, is basically what you're going to get if you're just a normal person, not exercising regularly. And but a fit person is going to be much greater, and a world-class athlete, like 35 liters per minute. So they can pump a lot of blood. So here you can see the distribution of the blood, and you can see it's mostly going to the muscles when you're exercising. Everything else is kind of like detouring the blood vessels. Capillaries are closed off by little sphincter muscles so that it bypasses the digestive system, it bypasses the renal, it bypasses, so where digestive would have been at rest, would have been 27%. Now when you're exercising, it goes down to 3.4. And again, this has to do with like the systemic or the sympathetic nervous system is active, or parasympathetic here, so you're getting more blood to the digestive system, more digestion is going on at rest. But in exercise, you don't need to be digesting, you need to get ATP, and you need to get that oxygen to the muscles. So the blood is going mostly to the muscles to provide it oxygen, so it can go through cellular respiration, aerobic cellular respiration, not fermentation, and so you can get enough oxygen to do what you need to do.
Is that where it uses fat to burn?
Right, so you'll have fat burning will be going on there because it's going to get that ATP from the fat too. So if you get your heart rate up to above like 90 something, then you're in the fat burning zone, and that even if you're not exercising, you're still going to be in the fat burning zone. You maintain that. It's aerobic. So it's like 120, 130 beats per minute. So it depends on your age and whether you're male or female. But so, and then how athletic you are. But so the cardiac output, there are certain things that increase, and then there are other things that decrease the cardiac output. And so some of the things that increase the positive cardiac output would be your T3 and T4 hormones. Obviously, metabolism is going to be raised. Nicotine, caffeine, low calcium, which this is weird because you'd think that, because calcium is required for contraction, you'd think that low calcium would increase the heart, would decrease the heart. Low calcium actually increases the heart rate. If you have hyperkalemia or calcemia, that's when you have high calcium levels, then you will decrease the heart rate. So of course the sympathetic is going to increase, and the parasympathetic is going to decrease. We know that because of norepinephrine and epinephrine, and the parasympathetic with acetylcholine. But these other factors you need to be aware of, and the weird one for me is always calcium, because it just doesn't seem to make sense, because you need calcium to contract the muscles, but actually low calcium is actually going to be increasing the heart rate. Glucagon is what's going to increase your blood, and we haven't really talked about glucagon much. So insulin decreases blood glucose. So if your blood glucose levels are too high, what do you give a patient, or if you're working in a healthcare facility, a resident, what do you give them? Insulin. So this lowers your blood glucose. So the opposing pancreatic hormone is glucagon. So it does the opposite. It raises blood glucose. And why would you need to do that? Well, why would you need it why would that increase cardiac output? It needs glucose. That's a fuel. And then you need the oxygen from the blood, and you can make ATP. But you got to have that thing that's the beginning of ATP, which is glucose. So there are other factors that also affect the heart rate. And there's a whole table of that in your book in chapter 19. It's sort of at the end of the chapter, and I did a little video on this and I had a whole slide, but it's apparently not on this slide. It didn't get saved. So it's on page 734. So there's positive chronotropic. Chrono means time. So which was that going to do? Is that going to increase heart rate or is it going to increase the stroke volume to increase cardiac output? Chronotropic. So it's going to increase heart rate because that's time, like how quickly. So time. Inotropic has to do with agents that are dealing with the heart contraction. And so you've got, again, positive chronotropic and negative chronotropic. You got positive inotropic and negative inotropic. And they're in a list there. Obviously, if you have less oxygen, do you think that's going to increase or decrease the heart contraction? Decrease, because you don't get enough oxygen, you're not getting enough ATP, you're not making, so if you don't have enough ATP, you can't contract. So that's going to affect it. And if you have hypercapnia, that means you have too much CO2. That's also going to cause acidosis, and these things will decrease the heart rate because the acids will change the shape of the enzymes that are involved with all these chemical reactions, and it's going to be less efficient. And so acidosis, both acidosis and alkalosis affect it, but we'll talk about acidosis and alkalosis later. So I knew we weren't going to get through to chapter 9 or to chapter 20 today. There are only 2 sections in chapter 2 that we're going to cover. We're going to do that during lecture on Monday. It's mainly like the structure of the veins and the arteries and the capillaries, which there are 3 layers: epicardium, epithelium. Sorry. We'll get to that next time. But it's like there's endothelium in the middle. The endothelium is in the middle. That's the single layer. Then you have a muscle layer, and then you have the outer layer. So we'll get into all those different layers of the veins and the arteries. The tunica adventitia, the tunica externa, that's not it. Tunica interna, media, and externa. That's it. That's what they call them. But it's basically like your endothelium's on the inside, and you have your epithelium on the outside, sort of, and then you have your muscle layer in the middle. So we'll get into that. Also, the big thing is blood pressure, and talking about how viscosity affects the blood pressure as well as the heart rate. So we've already kind of talked about the heart rate. So we're going to look at how the blood vessels, like how big they are around, so constriction, dilation, and the viscosity of the blood and the length of the blood vessels affect that. But that's just the first 2 sections of chapter 19, and you should read through those. I'll probably do a recording over those and then post that, so if you want to watch it over the weekend, you can, and then that'll help you to get prepared. There will be a quiz over chapter 19. That'll be due on Monday, and then I'll put a chapter 21 quiz up there. That'll be due on Monday as well. So you're going to have 2 quizzes due on Monday over the weekend, so work on those. That's just to help you see what you're having difficulty with, and also it gives you practice questions. But just go over the PowerPoints, look at them, see how they, try to make up your own questions ahead of time, and then take the quiz. Because if you do that, you're going to probably predict maybe half of the questions that I'm going to put up on the test. So if you have one of these heart, brain,